So much uncertainty, so much unrest, so much violence in the streets of Beirut following the huge blast that took place in hangar number 12 of the port in the city itself. So, what happens to Lebanon next? Welcome to Intuitive Reactions, the MENA and Gulf regions. This is number 10. Let me start with a quick recap. The protests in the streets did not actually start on the 4th or 5th of August, following that dreadful explosion that wrought so much damage, caused many deaths, so many people injured and now homeless. The protest started on the 17th of October 2019. And they've been ongoing since then. There have been peaks and there have been troughs for many reasons, partly fatigue by the protesters, partly because of the COVID-19 pandemic and the quarantines, partly by the reaction of the security forces. So we've seen sometimes people flocking into the streets, and then sometimes there's been some quiet. And in the middle, a lot of journalists, a lot of intellectuals, a lot of historians, a lot of political observers, either in the country itself, in Lebanon or abroad, have basically asked themselves, what next? What happens to this country? I mean, if you follow some of what is being said about the politicians and the parliamentarians and the people in authority, it's quite clear to me that the masks have fallen, that all the emperors of yesteryears have lost their clothes, they're naked. People are talking about corruption openly, about cronyism, nepotism, thievery, mismanagement, misrule, the fact that there is a small class of privileged, very rich people versus the majority of the Lebanese population hardly having enough money to eat and unable, even if they had the money, unable to take it out of the banks because of the situation with the banks and the severe limitations imposed upon them by the central bank. So the situation is really bad. Labels have been given. There have been some brave journalists, quite brave actually, by any standards, not only Lebanese standards, but also Western standards, who've been on different news programs saying what they think of the ruling classes and what they think should happen. Mass resignations are being asked for, starting with the president himself, Michel Aoun, all the way to the ministers, to the deputies in parliament, to the intelligence and security heads. Everybody, they say, should go so that Lebanon could start all over again. And in fact, the explosion that happened on the 4th of August and resulted in so much damage, physical to lives and material to houses and neighborhoods, has basically, as many of you know, has necessitated, has created an interest by the international community to try and help. There have been virtual summits, there have been visits. Emmanuel Macron was in Lebanon, people from the European Union, people from the Arab League, people from Turkey, everybody is coming to try and see how they can help. But what does that help mean? Is that help to get the country back on its feet, or is it more help in terms of humanitarian help? And where does that humanitarian help go? The virtual summit that took place yesterday, initiated by the French president and with the participation of the high and mighty, including, surprisingly for me, President Donald J. Trump, basically managed to get about 250 million euros pledged for humanitarian relief and assistance for Lebanon. but that is conditional on the money going to the people via NGOs, via the United Nations organizations, etc., etc. It doesn't take much to realize that there is a Gordian knot. And as I talk to you today, as I try to see through that Gordian knot, as I try to see through the layers upon layers of complications in Lebanon, how does one unravel, untie those knots in order to help Lebanon stand up again? I mean, I started by saying that the latest protest started on the 17th of October, and today we are almost in the middle of August, and there has been only one person who's lost his job voluntarily or otherwise, and that's the former Prime Minister of Lebanon. Nobody else has lost his jobs until recently, when a few deputies in parliament and a couple of ministers decided to resign because they couldn't take the pressure anymore, and they couldn't take the inertia of the government that really is not even there. I mean, people talk of a government. There is no government there. It's almost like window dressing, political window dressing, placed there just so that Lebanon could claim to the outside world that it has a government, which it doesn't really. But change is difficult. Who's going to be able to do the change? Who's going to be able to sweep away all those political dinosaurs, all those emperors without clothes, all those masks that have fallen? How is this going to happen? Is it going to be the journalists? I mean, there have been some, as I've just said, who've been really critical, pungently critical of the situation in Lebanon. Fine. We know that. A lot of people know that. The question is, okay, words, where do the actions go? Protests? A lot of people are betting that the protests would force the hand of those politicians from the president downward to actually resign. I'm not too sure that they would. Some of them are so tightly connected to the networks and systems that have prevailed in Lebanon for over 30 years, that it's very difficult for me to imagine them voluntarily leaving. Not only because they would lose their interests, I mean, whatever they wanted to accumulate, they've already done so, but because they would probably be afraid of accountability. Once they lose their office, they lose part of their immunity and protection, and therefore they would be liable to measures of justice. So I'm not sure how the protests are going to impact the situation in Lebanon. I watched with keen interest the big demonstrations called the demonstrations or protests of revenge that took place on Saturday. And yes, there was violence, yes, there was anger, yes, there was frustration, but we already know all this. But I'm not sure there is any strategy, any roadmap by those protesters to try and take the country forward. And one of the questions I would ask is, let us assume that everybody from the president to the ministers, the government, headed by pretty much an irrelevant prime minister, to the parliament, let us assume that they all leave their offices. What happens next? Who's going to come and take over? What is the plan? What's plan B? What's the default plan? I'm not being pessimistic unduly. I'm being a little bit pragmatic about this. That yes, the passions, the frustrations, the anger that has been bottled up in the majority of Lebanese hearts and minds has basically overflowed. But the question is, thinking reasonably, how would this be done? Through the journalists? They're a conduit for this anger and frustration. They are not its implementing arm. The protests, I mean, the protests are violent at times, peaceful at most times, but they are unable to budge a system that's been rooted, anchored into the political soil of the country for so long. Voluntary resignations? Maybe. I have no idea if that is going to happen too. But For instance, following the explosion and just before the explosion, the Maronite Catholic Rite Patriarch of Lebanon suddenly started talking about Lebanon regaining its neutrality. Why? Because I think he realized that we were coming to a very, very dangerous stage in the life of Lebanon, and he thought that something radical has to be done. And the neutrality that he talked about was basically Lebanon adopting a neutrality from all the conflicts surrounding it, Iran, Syria, Saudi, all others. Now, it's interesting because the explosion, the blast that took place on the 4th of August, people haven't noticed, but some of the most damaged areas or neighborhoods are places like Jemaise, like Shaitawi, like Mar Mikhail, like Ashrafiye. These are places that are largely inhabited by Christians. So whilst until now, everybody used to claim that the protests and the events are taking place in the so-called western side of Beirut, which is predominantly Muslim, now the impact has come to the so-called East or Christian Beirut. And therefore, there is almost a level playing field going on. And people are worried across the whole of Beirut as to what the outcome is going to be of those protests, of the ensuing violence, of the uncertainty and the restive political situation in the country. But there is one thing that I would like to tell you about or share with you, if you don't mind. I've always thought, and this is nothing only symptomatic of Lebanon, it happens across the world, but it is so acutely visible in Lebanon, that despite the protests, despite the corruption, despite the inertia, despite the fact that there is almost no sign of how to get out of this crisis, of this blockage, as it were, politically, how does one funnel in the money to save Lebanon from itself, in some sense, to help all those hundreds of thousands of people who've lost their homes and are now basically living from hand to mouth? If all this is fine, but there is one thing that undergirds all this uncertainty, and that is the political system configuration in Lebanon. There is no national identity. When you talk about Lebanon, you don't talk about the Lebanese idea. Some people, particularly the younger men and women, are beginning to talk about the Lebanese idea, which is why the protests are full of Lebanese flags with the cedar proudly on that flag. But most people still think not in Lebanese national terms or identities, but in terms of sectarianism. I am with this warlord, I'm with that leader, I'm with this faith, I'm with that confession. And until such time as the sense of citizenship, which is part and parcel, which is an unshakable part of national identity, becomes the steering thought in Lebanon, it's going to be very difficult to overcome the chapters of uncertainty and unrest that assail this country. And there are so many organizations and agencies, Carnegie, Adyan Foundation, are wonderful organizations, journalists, speakers, intellectuals, writers, who are basically saying that we should divest ourselves of those allegiances and focus on the concept of citizenship and the concept of national identity. This is where I'll stop. There is so much more I can say, but I don't want to throw in too much. This is just a foretaste of where we are, where I think we are with Lebanon, a country I love so much and a country I have often admired, even now, even in the midst of all the troubles, of all the corruption, of all the uncertainty. There is something about Lebanon, the country, the people, the message that resonates with me. And so I will leave it with this. It's enough for one episode of YouTube. And I'll tell you what I'm going to do. For my next week, for the so-called summer break, although really break is a redundant word given the coronavirus issues we have in this country as well as worldwide, I'm going to try and read a book called Annals by a Roman historian, Tacitus. I think he has a lot to say what he wrote during the times of the Roman Empire. I think it has a lot to say with what is happening not only in Lebanon today, but across the MENA region as a whole. Have a nice week ahead and all the best to you.